In this set of lectures, we're going to talk about cell signaling, which is how cells within an organism talk to each other. And so here's a cartoon from the awkward Yeti of the stomach and tongue bullying brain into ordering unhealthy fried food instead of something healthy like a salad. We're going to talk about how this communication happens. We're just going to brush the surface of this. These signals are actually really, really complicated sometimes, but we're going to start our understanding of how this kind of signaling happens. So first of all, what do we mean by cell communication or cell signaling? We're talking about communication inside an animal body, such as your body, like your stomach talking to your brain, but also your skin talking to your brain, your stomach talking to the intestines, all kinds of signals going around your body to control movement and intake of food and things like that. Also, communication inside the body of a plant or a multicellular protist or a fungus, all of those things, the cells inside need to communicate about where resources need to go and things like that. Also, communication between single-celled organisms. We're going to primarily talk about communication within multicellular organisms, but we're going to come back to this one. So the communication that needs to happen is regards where resources are, where the resources are needed, what stimuli is present. So, for example, a plant might need to tell cells, this leaf is being eaten by an insect. We need to send defensive chemicals to that site. That's resources and stimuli being responded to. Now, there are 4 types of chemical signals, and we're going to walk through all of them. Autocrine is self-talk. Auto means self. So this is a cell targeting itself, which seems like a very strange pathway, but there's a point to it. There's also cells that have connected cytoplasms. We learned about gap junctions when we learned about the cell. So you remember that's where the 2 cells have channels between the cytoplasms, literally going through the plasma membranes of both cells, so that anything that happens in the cytoplasm of one cell happens in the cytoplasm of the next. Plants and some multicellular protists also have something called plasmodesmata, which are the same thing. They're just a slightly different structure, so they have a different name, but they connect to the cytoplasm. Paracrine signaling is where neighbors talk to each other. This is a signal that goes from one cell to the next cell and no farther. That seems like it wouldn't be particularly useful, but it is, and we're going to explain that. And then endocrine is long distance. So para means next to, so paracrine is going to the next cell. Endo means inner or within. So endocrine signals are going to be within the body, as opposed to exocrine, which are things, for example, that are secreted outside of a body. So let's talk autocrine signaling. So why would a cell send a signal to itself? Well, there's a couple of really important times that this happens. One is during early development. A cell needs to make sure that it develops into the right thing, and in order to do that, genes need to be turned on and off. And the signals for turning on genes usually come from outside the cell, actually. And so the cell sends a signal to itself to start that process of turning those genes on and off. The other is if a cell is infected with a virus, it may need to self-destruct or do something we call apoptosis. And that self-destruction, again, that signal for self-destruction usually comes from the outside. So a cell can send itself a signal to say, time to self-destruct. Linked cytoplasms. So in animal cells, we have gap junctions. In plant cells and algae, we have plasmodesmata. These link the cytoplasms of the neighboring cells with channels that go literally through the plasma membrane. And it's really beneficial because ions and other small molecules can pass very quickly between the cells. This is really important in the heart of animals because the heart cells have gap junctions so that the electrical signal that causes one to contract goes immediately to the next one almost simultaneously so that all of the cells contract together. Plant cells can share small proteins, other molecules that are small, to regulate growth. So you may have heard that some plants can actually follow the direction of the sun during the day. They do that by actually growing one side of the stem and then growing the other side of the stem. And so they need to be able to send signals very quickly from one cell to the next to determine who's going to grow and who's not in response to those light signals. Okay, so that was linked cytoplasms. Paracrine signaling, this is the talking to the neighbors. Remember, para means next to. These are going to be very fast and very short duration signals. So these are going to be one signal very quickly from one cell to the next. And this is how your neurons communicate. This is how your nervous system talks to the rest of your body and to itself. So here's two neurons. Signal's going to come in this end, travel down this long thing, go out these branches, come in that end of the next cell, and go down and out to another cell. And if you're wondering, what if it wants to go the other way? It doesn't. It only goes one way. That's how your neurons work. It's more complex than this lecture is going to cover, but your neurons only send signals in one direction. It's actually a very cool mechanism, but not for today. So for today, I just want you to remember neurons send signals in one direction. The connection between the neurons is actually not an intercellular junction. It's a gap. We call it a synapse. So we have the presynaptic cell, which is this one, which sends a signal through the synapse to the postsynaptic cell, which is this one, okay? And the presynaptic neuron builds up vesicles with neurotransmitters. And those are just molecules that can bind to a receptor on the postsynaptic cell. Caffeine is a neurotransmitter. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, things like that. So when an electrical signal comes down here, the neurotransmitters are released through exocytosis. Aren't you glad you learned exocytosis now? And they flood into the synapse, which is this little gap between the two cells, and they bind to receptors on the postsynaptic cell. Most of the time, they open a channel. The neurotransmitter does not go into the postsynaptic cell. It's either degraded by an enzyme or it's pumped back into the presynaptic cell to get recycled, which is really, really common. So presynaptic cell releases neurotransmitters by exocytosis into the synapse, which bind to receptors and open a channel, causing an electrical charge change in the next cell and propagating the signal. This is paracrine signaling. It's very quick, and it only targets from one cell to the next. So your brain can send very, very specific and precise signals because one cell can communicate with exactly one other cell. It can communicate with lots of others. All of these could be linked to other cells, but it can send very, very precise signals to very specific targets. So that's why paracrine signaling is useful. Now, when we talk about signaling, we have a few terms that we need to know. Signaling cells, that's the cell that releases the signal. So in this one, the signaling cell is the presynaptic neuron. The target cell is the cell that receives the signal. In this case, the target cell is the postsynaptic cell. In an autocrine case, the signaling cell and the target cell are the same thing. We're going to talk about with endocrine, the signaling cell and the targeting cell can be very far apart. The way the target receives the signal is that it has a specific receptor in its cell membrane. So the receptor is a protein molecule. It's embedded in the cell membrane of the target cell, and it binds to a specific molecule. Remember, we talked about how enzymes are very, very specific about what they bind to. Receptor proteins are also very, very specific. They're shaped to bind to one specific thing. That's what they bind to. And then the ligand is what we call the signaling molecule. Okay, so remember the thing that binds to an enzyme is called the substrate. Here, the thing that binds to the receptor is called a ligand. It is released by the signaling cell, and then it binds to the receptor on the target cells. Okay, so these are some terms we're going to be using as we go forward. The binding of the ligand to the receptor protein causes what we call a conformational change, and I think I've used this term before, but I'm not sure, so I just wanted to show you. A conformational change is just a shape change. Conform, meaning with the form. So this is a kinesin protein in blue, and as it gets phosphorylated, as this, oops, come back. Are you not going to play again? There we go. As it gets phosphorylated, see that green thing added? It changes shape. Okay? So that's a conformational change. All right, our final type of signaling is called endocrine signaling. And in this case, signaling cells in one area release ligands that bind to receptors far away. They might not necessarily be that far away, but they're a lot farther than a paracrine signal goes. Your brain produces growth hormone that can bind to cells all over the body and stimulate cell growth or replication, replacement of old cells and things like that. The endocrine cells in your stomach produce something like gastrin, which stimulates acid production by other cells in the stomach. So there's cells in one area of the stomach that actually send out a signal that travels through the bloodstream to other cells to tell those cells to produce stomach acid when you've eaten a meal. We call these endocrine signaling molecules hormones. In animals, they're going to travel through the bloodstream to get to the target cells. In plants, they will travel through the vascular system to the target cells. Yes, plants do have veins. The veins in a leaf are actually veins that carry fluids throughout the plant. So yeah, that's a thing. Don't worry, we'll come back to that and we'll learn more about that later. All right, we're going to stop this there, and I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about the different kinds of endocrine signaling, the different kinds of receptors, different kinds of molecules involved.